My guest tonight is Jay Dyer. Jay returns again to the show to discuss, well, a broad range of topics tonight. But Jay, how are you doing tonight?
Well, as always, Tim, thank you.
Well, thanks for coming on again tonight. Listen, you got a couple, you got a new show and an event coming up. You want to plug that?
Yeah, the event will be lecturing on predictive programming in Hollywood in relationship to secret space program and or breakaway civilization ideas, well, as they are in film. So that'll be in Bastrop slash Austin, Texas, October 31st to November 1st. And if anyone out there is interested in coming, I will be paid through using the code to sign up. So if you go to the site and you put in SSP Dyer 2015, that's how I'm going to be paid. So please sign up that way, use the code, you get a discount, and yeah, it should be an interesting conversation. I've been working the last month or so, preparing my thoughts on this in relationship to a host of films, some of which you've seen analyzed at Jay's Analysis, and some which have not been yet analyzed and will not be posted. So I can't have it all out there. I got to have some secrets and some mysteries to reveal. But the radio show, I'm 3 episodes deep now and got the 4th one coming up. They're all loaded up, ready to go when the Talk Network through Natural News premieres, I believe, in a few weeks, 3-4 weeks maybe. And yeah, it's looking good. We've got interview with Freeman and Jamie, and we've got an interview with Richard Grove done, and an interview with Mark Hackard. So we're looking at some more film analyses to come, and the tie-ins to geopolitics, conspiracy, and all things esoteric. So.
And that's Esoteric Hollywood?
It is, yeah.
Okay, the show. And of course, Jay, you're the host of Jay's Analysis. That's your website where you analyze, geopolitics, current events, culture, movies, of course, as you say. Of course, it's listener supported. And you have a tab there that if you go to the site and you like his work, I encourage everyone out to support it, because none of this is free. Of course, we all spend our time doing this, and time is the one true unrenewable resource out there.
Yeah, so, I got recently been accused that it's a big money scam that I'm running here. I'm making so much money from this, right?
Are you really foundation funded? Is that what's going on?
Oh, right. Yeah, that's where all the money comes from. And then you're right. So this just it's a shell corporation known as Jay's Analysis that's a front for vast money laundering operations, and that's why I live in a small farmhouse.
Well, with all that cash flow coming through PayPal, it's easy to launder all that drug money. So there you go. Just a joke. Okay. Well, tonight, how do I title this? It's based on a number of your articles and interviews done that I found particularly interesting, and I wanted to perhaps question you on some of the things that have been brought up on some of these other shows, and I guess put my own interpretation on, or at least allow you to provide a different interpretation based on my interaction with you.
Sure.
Stagecraft-as-Statecraft, Occult Magick, Secret Societies, Intelligence Agencies, the Deep State, Weird and Wacky, Left versus Right Trap. So where do you want to begin with that? What's the best way to approach this?
Begin any way you'd like.
Well, you recently did a thing with James Corbett on The Prestige. I think it's a good intro.
Yes.
Okay. Want to talk a little how that applies, maybe what we're being fed these days in the media and the news and that sort of thing?
Right. Go for it.
Well, The Prestige is a 2006 film directed by Christopher Nolan. Right. He also does the Batman trilogy, which is full of all types of messages and esoteric meaning, I guess you could say, and even predictive programming. Mm-hmm. In The Prestige, it's about these 2 competing magicians, and it's about creating fake reality through magic. How does that apply to maybe what some of the events we've been observing the past maybe 15, 20, maybe 80 years?
Well, statecraft is stagecraft. It's always been used by the state, the stage that is, to promote the ideology of the state. So all the way back to the ancient Greeks, and I'm sure part of that with the Egyptians, Babylonians, it was always the purview of the ruling class to make sure that what you saw in the theater and in music and the arts was amenable to the desires of the political establishment. And so I always cite examples like Virgil's Aeneid, which was Roman state propaganda. And so you would always have in history the you would have patrons, right, who would patronize the arts, and these great patrons would either be wealthy families that sort of ran the state from behind the scenes, the Medici's, that kind of thing, where you would have Roman state might patronize Virgil, dear Virgil, please write us a great epic, or to Shakespeare and the different. I mean, it's not black and white. It's not like every piece of every playwright, every play that's been written was always propaganda. I'm not saying that, but it's always been a useful tool. So, um, you see this then in the modern realm, modern world quite clearly, and I think it's portrayed very clearly, very astutely by Nolan in that film The Prestige. So it's based on a novel about magicians at the turn of the century who are basically in they're complete nemesis of one another, and they're from different backgrounds. One's a nobleman, one's sort of a poor guy, working class dude, and they have this rivalry. But in the film incarnation, as we've seen with many Nolan films, we have the interjection of quite a few esoteric elements. Quite often, I would say in every film that Nolan does, all the way back to Memento or Insomnia, you have the playing with archetypes quite clearly, Jungian archetypes, into the Batman trilogy. That's very prevalent in the Batman trilogy, referenced explicitly by Cillian Murphy's character, Sandman, or whatever his name was, I can't remember, but he specifically references Carl Jung when he's doing his mind control experiments in the film. And so Nolan is no stranger to these things, and with films like Interstellar and The Prestige, you have all these hints and these references, these subtleties, this Twilight language, however you want to phrase it, that do continually pop up. So if we look at The Prestige, I think we're looking at, on one level, the stages of the magic act that Michael Caine lays out at the beginning, and the movie is centered around that same triadic structure. And then in the real world, we can see a parallel for how the masses are controlled through, I guess, what you could call the royal art of managing the masses through stagecraft theater, the projection of power, the illusion of power, the manipulation of archetypes, the willingness of the crowd to be entertained, to suspend their disbelief, to shut off rational faculties, and to want to be duped. So we have what many have called duper's delight, which is the pleasure, I suppose you could say, that the mastermind gets from duping the audience, and then the converse of that would be the willingness to be duped on the part of many of the audience. So that, I think, is what we see in The Prestige, presented very well. And so there's that, this iconic scene of the old Chinese magician who they can't figure out how he does his act, and so Christian Bale and his nemesis guy, he played by Hugh Jackman, are sitting there debating how he does this trick, and Christian Bale says, "Well, it's because that dude lives his act, right? The whole thing is an act, and that's how he's able to pull it off." And Hugh Jackman says, "Oh, I can't believe that. I can't accept that. That's just too much." And that we can apply that perfectly to geopolitics, espionage, and statecraft, because that's really what so much of it is the projection of image, the projection of power, even when there may or may not be that actual substantial power present. So that's how theater is very useful. We think back to the time of Desert Storm 1, when it became like a TV series. So we had all these promos that would run on the news networks of Desert Storm, Operation Freedom, or whatever it was, and then it would be tied into Freedom Fries, and Bill Clinton's jogging into McDonald's and grabbing Freedom Fries. And so you think about something like Wag the Dog. It's another good example where they have that scene where not just the faked war, but the scene where they're actually creating a song for the war. However it goes, we defend our American borders. Willie Nelson's brought in to write this song for this fake war because they wanted to have it, and then they have T-shirts that go along with the war. So those are just examples of what we see in the Prestige as applied to magic and stagecraft in the geopolitical and deep state sphere of things. And then, you can go as far and deep as you want with this, with references to Tesla and references to secret and suppressed technology that's going on in Colorado in the film, and they're wirelessly transmitting energy, and David Bowie's playing Tesla and all this stuff. And of course, David Bowie was for a time a member of the Order of the Golden Dawn, and all sorts of turns and twists that you can take with that film and the people that were chosen to play the roles. So yeah, that's what I would say about the Prestige, and we can then apply that to things like 9/11, or where you have this massive event, which is, I would argue, the distraction, and then the reveal is that the turn, or whatever you want to say. That's we got to erect a even more powerful establishment of surveillance and a more powerful foreign policy of invading places that had obviously nothing to do with 9/11. That's the trick.
The one observation I think you made in one of the interviews regarding the Prestige was the Scarlett Johansson's character in that movie.
Oh yeah.
How she's
sexual,
she's the Fox News babe. Right?
That's a good analogy, right? So
Yeah.
she's also the swallow, because the sex pot, the sex operative, because Hugh Jackman's character commissions her to go and spy on Christian Bale, and she ends up seducing him, and then you're kind of, and Christian Bale's onto it, and you're kind of wondering, whose allegiance does she have, and she doesn't probably really even know what she's up to, and nor do the Fox News babes really probably know what the heck's going on in the world. And and Christian Bale's he doesn't trust her, so she doesn't figure out for a long time that Christian Bale actually has a twin. So it's a good way to put it. She's like a info babe.
I think you made that observation. Don't give me credit. I think I'm just
Did
kidding.
I? Okay.
Yeah. Just mimicking what you said, copying what you said earlier. I thought it was an interesting observation. But Christopher Nolan, he's an interesting character. His other films, the Batman trilogies, I forget which one it was, but talk about predictive programming, is the one that unveils total surveillance.
Yeah, the first one has that with when they go into that building, and Morgan Freeman's character, Lucius, Lucifer, he has developed all the secret tech, because Wayne Enterprises is kind of this big private conglomerate that also has all this suppressed secret tech. And he's developed the ability to surveil an entire area with sonar, with sound, so that cell phones can ping with sound waves, and then when it bounces back, you can sort of get an image of the what's in the room, right? So that's just one way that surveillance can be had, not just audibly, but you can actually through sound get a visual image of what's going on in a 3D setting. So that was revealed in the first one, and then it comes up again later on, and of course, throughout that trilogy, there's just a whole host of revelations of things like that. Absolutely.
Of course, there's the famous Sandy Hook reference.
Yeah. And it's also worth noting that in the first film, as I've said, the League of Shadows, that's Liam Neeson's running this secret society that's kind of a Tibetan, Himalayan, Far Eastern ninja cult, and then Bruce Wayne joins it and learns all the strategies and black op techniques and all that stuff, and they use drugs, and so that's how Bruce Wayne figures out what's up when the Ra's al Ghul, the villain character, attacks Gotham City, and he attacks the water supply and he attacks the air. So there's a bio warfare attack that is based around drugging the populace that the Ra's al Ghul does in concert with Sandman or whatever Cillian Murphy's character's name, and he's the sort of the mad scientist character who's compare him. It's a oblique reference to kind of the MK Ultra doctors, right? So the mind control aspect of it is being done through the water and air supply.
The another film I think you've mentioned recently is well, it's a book actually. It came out as a film in the '60s, but I think it's better known as the book. Is the Magus, and that reveals a lot, or at least there's an interesting, I guess you could say, symbolism or analogies in that might explain our current condition.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun reading the Magus. Probably 4 or 5 years ago, I was at college. I was working the desk, so I had a lot of downtime to read, and in the library. And somebody recommended the Magus, and I thought, well, okay, this looks interesting. And actually was on the graduate reading list for the program. You had options. You could, what classics you wanted to choose in the grad reading list. And so I was like, I'll read this. It's on the list. And yeah, it's Fowles is writing this sort of postmodern novel, and it's after he wrote it sometime in the '60s, early '60s, I think, and he quite obviously is keyed into how the occult world and all that, and the spy world and geopolitics, because he translates it all into the novel. And so I would have to say that to date, we talk about, for lack of better terms, quote Illuminati type novels. Everybody knows about Eyes Wide Shut, and there's the novella or novel that German novel that's based on. But yeah, I mean, the Magus is probably one of the most. I guess you could think of maybe Robert Anton Wilson's Illuminatus trilogy as well, but the Magus is really, really profound. I mean, it's pretty wild what's in that novel. Comparable, I guess, to what you could say with Fleming, but Fleming's a little more cheese, a little more pop. This is pretty hardcore. I mean, it's really wordy. It's probably 600 pages probably.
And it's about an oligarch, or a billionaire or a millionaire, I guess, at that time, inviting this, I guess you could say, a kind of a know-it-all younger guy who's thinks he's got it all figured out because he's got a degree and he's smart, and he goes to this island and he is subjected to these various, I guess, trauma-based psyops.
Yeah, so Nicholas Earth is this Oxford lad who is kind of a ne'er-do-well. He's a smart guy, but he's kind of a ne'er-do-well, and I think he's in his early 20s in the novel, and he's abandoned all his previous religious and philosophical views, and he's just this nihilist, existentialist kind of guy, and he believes in nothing, and he's very proud of it. And he's got this girlfriend that he's not really into, and I think I remember if he's cheating on her, she cheats on him or something. Anyway, they break up. They have this big breakup, but he doesn't care, and so he decides he needs to get away for a while, get away from London, and he picks this Greek island where he can just kind of go relax and maybe do a little bit of teaching in a school or something, and the teaching abroad program, I guess. But so he ends up there, and all these weird things start happening. And by chance, he meets this Greek. I can't remember. It's been 5 years. I think he's a shipping magnate. I can't remember exactly how Conchis has made his money, but Maurice is this basically owns the island, and it's a fictional island called Phraxus. But if you read the criticism on the novel, it has basis, in some Greek island. I don't know what, but anyway, so the weird things that start happening is he starts seeing things like Greek gods appearing, and they seem to be enacting these different ritual scenarios. And so he'll see Diana, and I think he sees Zeus or something, or Artemis or whatever, Apollo, and then he has these meetings with Conchise, and right away Conchise starts showing him the tarot deck, and he says, "Well, let me read your future here." So they go through this tarot reading scenario, and of course Nicholas is just laughing at him. He doesn't take him seriously, and the psyops, I guess we could say, start getting more and more and more elaborate. There's a beautiful woman who is supposed to be, we think, Maurice's lover, that Nicholas begins to have an affair with. And Nicholas is a little worried about Maurice finding out, but then he doesn't. Then he decides he doesn't really care, and so over time, we find out that Maurice was actually a Nazi collaborator, and so he's able, but he ended up very wealthy after the war, and he's been judged by a lot of people. So Maurice, the billionaire character. And so what he likes to do is bring people to the island, and someone like Nicholas. I don't think we know if Nicholas is the only person that's ever been through it, but he likes to engage in these kinds of psyops that don't just mess with the person, but they also put the person into moral quandaries that essentially annihilate or destroy their existing paradigm. So Nicholas has this extreme arrogance in his atheism, and what Maurice is able to do is consistently break down any kind of mental hiding place that Nicholas would like to flee to. So whether it's some philosophy like existentialism or some sort of secular human moralism or whatever, Maurice continually just breaks these down with these elaborate and increasingly elaborate staged scenarios. And so you come to find out that Maurice is actually using troops of actors. And the big reveal, of course, is, and so this is back in the 60s. Here's your crisis actors. So what you come to find out is that it's kind of a class warfare situation, not in a Marxist sense, but in the sense that Nicholas ultimately has all of his masks smashed, all of the things he would hide behind smashed, and he's shown that his moral judgments and his metaphysical perspectives are nonsense, and that it's precisely because he put himself in the position of God that Maurice chose him to be the fool in terms of the archetypes, right? Because in the climactic scene, Nicholas is drugged and trapped and brought into this ritual ceremony where there's a big pentagram and a bunch of people wearing goat masks and animal heads and stuff like that. And so Nicholas is just baffled. He doesn't know what the heck's going on. He's just out of his mind. And so Maurice has him tied down on this big judgment seat. And he says, okay, so judge us. And, Nicholas just kind of has a meltdown to know what to do. And that's the meaning seems to be, I think there's a statement that Maurice says, so you're an existentialist. Well, then you're condemned to be free. That's what Jean-Paul Sartre said. And if you're condemned to be free, then you can't hide behind the masks of atheism and these different pseudo-intellectual positions that you've adopted and judgments that you've adopted, Nicholas. And so Nicholas basically runs into a level of society and power that he didn't even know existed. And the irony there, of course, is that you claim to be so smart about how the world works, and you think that you know what's metaphysically true about the universe and that there is no God and all these outlandish, arrogant claims, and yet you don't even know how the real world works with powerful oligarchs who can hire a troupe of actors to fool the crap out of you. There's a great irony there.
Yeah, that's a number of things popped in my when I come to my mind. One of the things is the tricking that the person believing that he is indeed God himself, every man a god. Is that akin to maybe something that was the humanist movement that came out of the Renaissance? The idea that man was supreme? Would you find any criticism? Is that
well? It's always, I'd say that goes back to Genesis 3.
Uh-huh.
So in a way, yeah.
Yeah,
And
okay.
we see it flowering forth at different stages in human history. I mean, the Greeks kind of have that idea too.
Yeah.
And the Neoplatonists have it with their through theurgy and ritual operations. You can ascend the celestial sphere and become a god, and it's in all kinds of
Yeah. But
different forms. And then yes, it reappears in
yeah.
secular humanism. Yeah.
The well, one thing is the notion that there's a level of power which this person didn't know existed.
Yes,
He claimed to have it all figured out, but here he is, this whole different level of society. That seems to be something that maybe perhaps most of us are.
I think so.
Yeah.
That it's analogous to Eyes Wide Shut, because
Yeah.
that's what happens to Tom Cruise's character in that film, where he thinks he's at the top of the totem pole, top of the food chain. He's this wealthy doctor in New York going to elite parties, and then he stumbles into this situation where there's a whole other class of occultic elite that are even able to organize large scale fakeries and psyops that really freak him out, and he just doesn't know what to do. So it's very very similar setting there.
But this type of we're getting into here again with these stories. Again, what's being revealed to us is the fact that so much of what we assume to be reality, not so much that we're all, we can't tell what's real and there's no reality, there's no objective truth, but the idea, the mainstream news, what's retailed to us as history and current events, much of it is just fakery and BS.
Absolutely.
And to play games with us or to manipulate us, as you said, the royal art and the illusion.
Well, that's just my corner. I'm just
Yeah.
kind of using that term or whatever, but yeah, there's no question in my mind that that's the case, and the news is under no obligation to tell the truth.
Mm-hmm. We always get into the issue of media fakery and the histories of them being caught passing off fake news or misinformation or disinformation. But yeah, I was just doing some research on another topic, and I ran into this, even going back to World War II, where many of the speeches delivered by Winston Churchill on the radio were not Winston Churchill, they were an impersonator. Because he was either too ill or drunk or whatever. This guy named Norman Shelley, he used to go to parties and people close their eyes and he'd perform Winston Churchill impersonations. But
I'm actually Matthew McConaughey. And when you hear Matthew McConaughey, who is actually drunk, he can't actually go on camera and do that. That's actually my voice.
It's you. So, yeah, that's where you're raking in the big bucks, right?
Right. Yeah, that's my operation.
Do radio interviews for Matthew McConaughey.
But no, yeah, I mean that stuff is far more common than people think. I did want to say also that it's worth noting too that in the novel The Magus, there's a insight into the fact that and one reason I think that it's applicable to call it an illuminist novel is the fact that it's not based around the supernatural. So the power structure in that novel is still essentially human. It's just a wealthy oligarch who has a cadre of people who are in a cult, but we don't even know if the people in this cult really even believe in supernatural or demonic forces, because there's an extended dialogue when Nicholas is in the judgment seat about science and scientism, and that would actually be the real inheritance of the so-called Bavarian Illuminati, is that they were into scientism.
Mm-hmm.
It was people like Voltaire, right? So there is in that novel the presentation of science and scientism as the means by which the masses are ruled through social engineering.
And the scientists
Yes.
are the priests, the priesthood.
And all the people wearing the goat masks and the dog head Anubis mask or whatever, they're all scientists and PhDs and psychiatrists.
Is scientism distinguished from empiricism?
Absolutely. Empiricism is, well, technically yes, because scientism is the idea that science, of course, can sort of be the explanatory grand narrative for everything. Or the tendency in that direction. Empiricism is the philosophical movement of the Enlightenment era that the way that we gain our knowledge is through sense experience. So certainly there are tie-ins there, but there would, I think, probably be a technical distinction there, because you can have somebody like George Berkeley, the Anglican philosopher, who was an empiricist, but was actually not into scientism at all. So he still, I don't think he was successful, but he tried to mesh his empiricism with some sort of idealism, and thought he could prove theological claims that way. But and there are other philosophical schools that would fall into this category of being empiricist, but not necessarily adopting scientism, like phenomenology. Some phenomenologists might fall into that category.
I would guess scientism itself would be the, would you say it's a complete rejection of scholasticism? The idea that there's faith and reason, whereas science would say no.
I would kind of, except I would be a little more nuanced, just personally, my analysis of it. I would say that some of the extremes of scholasticism, and especially later scholasticism that you see in people like Aquinas or John Duns Scotus, is actually what led to the outbreak of scientism, precisely because they tried to do, maybe not so much Scotus as it would be definitely Aquinas, where they were actually trying to do empirical theology, in the sense of blending insights from Aristotle about human anthropology and how we obtain knowledge about the world, that I believe ultimately led to the outbreak of empiricism. And that's why you see people like Abelard having these debates even prior to Aquinas with Anselm. And so the Anselm was an early empiricist, an early nominalist, and so the nominalist tradition is the outgrowth, I believe, the illogical outgrowth of trying to do empirical theology, and what Aquinas called the analogia entis, or the analogy of being. So I think that those things they're not completely wrong, but I think that they contain within themselves the seeds by which you would have the Enlightenment.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, wow, I got it. Yeah, okay. I have
I have a couple pieces you might like where I was a hardcore Thomist for a long time, so I'm not coming at this from some sort of outsider apologetic position, but I've working within the realm of Thomism for so long and spending so much time in the Summas. I found that to ultimately not be a workable system, although I do, of course, think that Aquinas has a lot of great insights. He is an important thinker. Yeah. He's worth looking at. But I really think the root of it is what's called absolute divine simplicity in theology, and then what results from that in terms of hylomorphism from Aristotle, and how Aquinas tried to adopt an Aristotelian version of how the incarnation would happen, and how the sacraments work, and how the church works. And I just think all those things are very problematic when you already had a kind of normative philosophical milieu that was derived from the Eastern Fathers at the ecumenical councils. So
that isn't
so to get to empiricism. I'm sorry, I'm rambling, but just to sum that up, the reason that gets to empiricism is that you have these late medieval nominalists like Gabriel Bile, and they would be trying to formulate within Roman Catholicism, in the tradition of Abelard and the nominalists and William of Ockham, this way to get rid of universals and to get rid of the quasi-Neoplatonic influence from the time of Augustine in his On the Trinity forward in the West. These guys wanted to critique that and move away from that realism, as it's called in ontology, and they wanted to move towards a more empirical-based approach to theology and everything else. And so Aquinas, I'm not being unfair to Aquinas. I know that he cites Dionysius and the celestial hierarchy just as much as he cites Aristotle. I know he cites the Platonists quite a bit, as well as Augustine. But there is just no question in my mind that he altered the anthropology significantly with trying to borrow things like Aristotle's notion of abstracting our knowledge of universals from the objects through sense experience. And this was a new idea that that because the works of Aristotle had recently been translated from Islamic scholars in that day, and that's why they were for a while condemned in the West. There was like something like 100 and something propositions of Aquinas that his bishop had condemned for a while. These would later be accepted, as normative in the Roman dogmatic tradition, of course. But yeah, so I think that it's that milieu from which you get this notion that you can look at the external world, and through the analogy of being that was inherited via the Greeks, you could kind of reason your way up from the particulars and get an idea of what the essence of the absolute uh, being was. And so
Okay.
this is what you
Yeah.
see quite often in Aquinas. If you read the first few questions in the Summa, as well as if you read the first volume of the Summa Contra Gentiles, which is a completely separate Summa that's about apologetics, Aquinas lays out really clear what he thinks about all this, and it's a very different approach from what you see even in someone like Augustine, and it's very, very different from what you see in the Eastern Fathers, in my view.
Hmm.
So it's a different anthropology that becomes normative in the West for thinkers, and by the time of Luther, you have this reaction against Aquinas, but Luther especially, was very influenced by Gabriel Bile, and there's a great book on this by Heiko Oberman called Harvest of Late Medieval Theology, and it's Luther's Gabriel Bile's influence on Luther in terms of nominalism. So yeah, that's what happens with the Protestant Revolution, is that you have a much more willing acceptance of the the ideas of humanism at that time. Like John Calvin was a humanist. This tied into, of course, the printing press and all that, and the explosion of the idea that everything needed to be in the vernacular and so forth. So there's a whole bunch of concurrent movements going on at that time that contribute, and as well as the political issues of inter-European warfare and things like that, and princes aligning with the Lutheran ethos to oppose Rome and so forth. And so there's a lot going on there, which I recognize. I don't mean to oversimplify these vast swaths of history, um, but yeah, so that's what puts us in the position. And I'm aware too that there's Aquinas is a little bit different. He's not so much a nominalist in the sense of how he views. Excuse me, Calvin. Calvin is not so much a nominalist in the sense that he views things in this kind of Platonic way as well. So again, all these things are very hairy to ferret out at times, but Calvin really stresses that determinism and predestination. And so what I think, to sum up here, what happens is that the Reformation unleashes this ideology that had precedence in the late Middle Ages, that you can approach the natural world, and that theology is a science, like an empirical science, and so the two go together. Aquinas even called theology the queen of the sciences. And so then what that meant for the reformers was that either we need to drop all this scholastic stuff and get back to the Bible, or the development of Protestant scholasticism, which would be people like Francis Turretin and whoever Luther's co-reformer guy. It escapes me at the moment. This is stuff from like 10 years ago. But Luther has a cohort guy, that Melanchthon. Melanchthon is the scholastic Lutheran guy. So what happens then in the realms of science is that all this theology and philosophy filters into that as well, and these thinkers begin this trek of branching out into the natural world and approaching it from this rationalist perspective. And that's what a lot of the scholastic and Protestant incarnations of the Middle Ages fell into, was rationalism, and the idea that you could approach the natural world purely from the vantage point of human reason. Now, I understand that Aquinas would not say that he believes that there's supernatural grace that is a donum super additum to a super added gift on top of human reason that's natural. I understand all that, but what you have in the philosophical realm is this attempt to approach the natural world in that same way, as if you could read the totality of it and grasp the totality of it. And so this is what you see in figures like Bacon. And this is where it gets into that occult aspect of things.
Rosicrucianism?
Exactly. And there's also tie-ins between Lutheranism and the Rosicrucians as well. Many of the Johann Andre, many of these Lutheran thinkers that were prominent were also milling about in these
mystery schools, right?
Exactly, mystery school stuff. These alchemical, hermetical traditions that were floating around. Of course, a lot of the nobility were into this too, and so you can. Luther actually was influenced by Jacob Boehme, one of these alchemical, mystical writers as well, influenced by Neoplatonism, and so Luther really had a well of influences from which he derived his madness, and I really think he was kind of insane. And it's similar to what you see in the philosophical period of that time as well. The philosophical realm, you see just an explosion of a lot of these revolutionary ideals, and they're revolutionary in the sense of being completely against kind of what was the existing norms for how government's supposed to work. You know, how the law functions, common law, you know, all these things are challenged significantly in the West, and it just becomes as people characterize it, a kind of a revolution, right? So what I see is that we live kind of at the later stages of these just successive cultural, ideological, theological, philosophical revolutions. And, you know, everybody kind of thinks that they live in the apex of civilization. They live at the best times, and everybody in those old days was stupid and idiotic, and we're so smart now, and that's just really not true. And we really live in a slave society that I often point out. You think that you live under freedom and American constitutionalism and all this stuff, and you have no idea how much of a slave you are. And in fact, there were many ways in which you could probably say that a medieval serf had a lot more freedom than you.
Yeah, that's main point of our discussion tonight. It's true. This the illusion of freedom. I guess those no one is more enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free.
True statement, right?
You know, so that's what we're living under today because we have our consumer items, at least in the West. So we think because we can open the refrigerator and grab a beer and eat some some GMO laden snack foods and watch some asinine TV show that we're free.
Exactly. Right, that's true.
That's
whereas free. If even we have this idea, which actually comes from Mozart and Voltaire, that the Middle Ages was the Dark Ages, and everybody in that period was just really dumb, and they didn't know anything, and they thought there were monsters everywhere, and Yeah. Well, there have always been superstitious people. In fact, I think the Darwinian Dawkinites of our day are just as superstitious as the village serf in medieval France or something. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, it's just an assumption that we have about history that's completely not true, especially the more that you dig into history. And I had a lot of fun doing. I did history as my undergrad as well, so that was one of my favorite subjects. And I spent a lot of time in church history, which you come to learn quite quickly that most of what you hear is actually just not true. And so this idea of that that the Inquisition killed millions of people, that's just complete Protestant baloney that was made up about 100 years ago.
The Black Legend.
And even secular scholars like Henry Common in his book will admit, the Kamen will admit this now, that the Inquisition probably killed a couple thousand people.
Which was probably an afternoon in Stalin's Russia?
Exactly. And at the same time, on top of that, that wasn't even the Church's Inquisition. Most of that was the state-run Spanish Inquisition, which was completely separate from Gregory's Inquisition.
Yeah, and of course also dealing with the politics of 15th century Spain, which is the expulsion of the Muslims. Yeah, the Marranos. Of course, that's a whole other intrigue with the Marranos, which is the fake converts, and the intrigues behind Cromwell.
Yes,
that's fascinating. I mean,
I would love to. Put a lot of, like I said, most of my 20s I put into medieval theology and philosophy. So those are areas
Yeah.
that
Cromwell was bankrolled by Jews in Amsterdam.
I have read that. I have
Yeah.
read that. That does
Yeah.
come up in different, even mainline historical accounts at times. There's a couple. I think Rice has a good book on the religious wars of that period.
Hmm. And
Eugene Rice, I believe, off the top of my head.
so that's. But you mentioned this idea of we were talking about the Magus, where they were using these ideas of religion, religious imagery. I think you've talked or written earlier the possibility of these fake apparitions throughout history.
Hmm.
And I'm Catholic, and I believe by the very nature that I'm Catholic is I believe in miracles. Creation is a miracle because
I believe that. I believe the same. Yes.
yeah. So it's kind of like I don't need to be dazzled with visions of Mary in my egg salad. I don't need to. I that's why Catholic philosophy, natural law, looking at the kind of like the Thomistic way of looking at something, the wonders of nature, the irreducible complexity of everything. I'm sorry, I know God exists because I exist and I'm something, and something can't come from nothing. So, basic theology.
Well, yeah.
You know,
I might disagree on some of your.
well,
Yeah.
I'm obviously I'm.
I know.
Obviously, I'm
But
not
the
gonna.
basic points I totally agree.
Yeah, saying look around you. Come on, and obviously the methods or the mechanisms that the secular humanists have developed. I think you've talked about this, like Darwinism, are completely. I'm sorry, they just don't. They're just not valid because they don't explain. They don't explain anything.
I don't even think they get off the ground
No.
from the get go
Yeah.
because they don't even have coherent starting points.
Hmm. But you mentioned it kind of like the possibility of something like Fatima was staged, which
I do consider that possibility. Yeah, and
and they
even
say it's a possibility.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. You said how the Holy Mother revealed the errors of Russia
Hmm.
in the conversion, and I think you've said in the past that they never talk about the errors of, say, the British Empire.
Right. Yeah, I'm curious as to why
Yeah.
the Blessed Virgin didn't say that. I mean, and I'm well aware that there's a long history of fake crying icons. I'm sure that happens in the
Yes.
East as well. Sure.
And so, one has to be, I think Jesus is quoted as saying, the Bible is saying you must be as not
Well,
ten.
he rebuked the people for wanting signs and wonders.
Yeah, yeah. And so, and then people demand that these days. I find it rather
Yeah, and you can
childish.
look in the Western spiritual tradition as well with Saint John of the Cross. Like one of his early warnings when he's talking
Yeah.
about the dark night of the soul is he says, if you're seeking mystical visions and miracles and revelations, he said, you're prime for deception.
Hmm.
This is
Especially
all,
now.
exactly right. This is all
This is before CGI.
CGI, right? This is also in the Eastern tradition as well, in the Philokalia, where the Philokalia warns spiritual persons to not seek visions and miracles,
Hmm.
precisely because of what the East calls the sin of prelest, which is a spiritual. I think that's in the West as well. In the Western spiritual tradition, is the idea of spiritual arrogance, and that's
Yeah.
what that kind of stuff could lead to. And as you point out, the ease of being deceived. And so this goes all the way back to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy has the warning of not listening to just signs and wonders because signs and wonders even might be deceptive.
Could be the devil.
Sure.
Yeah.
Like Jannes and Jambres, right? Moses versus the Egyptian Magi.
Hmm.
And they were able to mimic, or however they did it, mock or whatever, the first couple signs that Moses does in Exodus.
Yeah. But yeah, the quote. I think the quote is, "You must be as tender or as gentle as lambs, but as clever as serpents."
Right. But there's also an explicit statement from Christ not to seek. A wicked and adulterous generation seeks signs and wonders, and none will be given to it. I believe he says that in the Olivet Discourse.
Hmm. But this gets back to the issue of fakery and deceit in the media, and this isn't something that we're possible because we're just speculating, and because we know that during the Cold War there was a plan, I think, put forth by the CIA to create false images of the Virgin Mother over Cuba.
Yeah, I did dig up that
Yeah.
old kind of a socialist journal that,
Mm-hmm.
that talked about that. I don't doubt that that's true. I mean, CIA would have no qualms doing that. That's been in other books as well, Victor Marchetti's book.
And these things again, false, false, false miracles can be their own little cottage industry.
Yeah, exactly.
So
I think Medjugorje is completely
yeah,
bogus. I thought that from the get-go, even back when I was traditional Roman Catholic, and all. And I attended the SSPX mass, and they were very critical of the even of Medjugorje as well. So yeah, that's.
hmm
I mean, anytime you have that situation of seers and visionaries claiming these things, whether it's the East or the West, the normative canon law does not permit you to immediately uh, adopt it as legitimate.
and and if faith were questioned as being, so we say, entertained with miracles,
Hmm.
it'd be easy.
Well, yeah, we
Yeah,
would all fall for the prestige type scenario.
exactly. Yeah.
There's a great analogy of this as well in the deuterocanonical section of Daniel called Bel and the Dragon. And in Bel and the Dragon, Daniel discovers that the Babylonian so-called magicians and priests were using this big idol that they were duping the people with, because the idol kind of seemed to move and would eat the sacrifices that were laid out. And Daniel figures out that that there's actually a little hole, and that this is like a machinery type thing, and that the priests were coming into this little hole and eating the sacrifice that was put out.
hmm
So there, even the law and the prophets and the wisdom texts of the Old Testament describe religious fakery.
Now, we get into the issue of, say, predictive programming in these movies, and you've written a lot about Fleming's James Bond character.
Hmm.
A lot of ways you can address that uh, with but the Bond, I guess the Bond series. One is, I thought you brought up in the best, is that one of the functions of the Bond series is social conditioning to accept the surveillance state, no privacy, the cult of gadgetry and high technology, and ultimately culminating in Skynet. and you know, um,
Yeah.
and what's funny about it, not funny, but what's interesting is I've heard a recent critique by Tom Secker regarding the Snowden affair. Now, his revelations are a form of conditioning, because he reveals to us the panopticon. All this is illegal, but nothing's being done about it. You had the skeptical of General Hayden, head of the CIA, and Keith Alexander, head of the NSA, caught lying in front of Congress. Nothing's done about it. Congress
Hmm.
passes laws legalizing ex post facto to illegal surveillance. Nothing's done about it. So it kind of makes us feel impotent and hopeless in this whole thing.
Well, it's just how it is.
Yeah. So it's kind of like I said, that's interesting. The Bond thing. It's kind of like it made spying sexy. In the '60s, there are all these TV shows, whether it's Mission Impossible or spoofs like Get Smart. It became part of
Yeah,
the culture.
yeah. It was a situation where, with World War One, I mean, you've always had spies, of course, but I don't think you had spy culture. That, like, even back in periods where there would be maybe a lot of spying going on, or even in the British Empire, stuff like that. I don't think you had this just monetized, popular culture of spying, and spy. So you could probably trace it back to literature, around the turn of the century, and novels like Kim and Rudyard Kipling and Graham Greene novels and stuff like that. And the rise of, like, pulp crime stories and true crime and all that, dime store stuff. And then but it really seems to, I mean, there were precedents prior to Bond, of course, but it really seems to be with Bond that it goes global. It really becomes this international phenomenon. That's what's part of what's so fascinating about that franchise, is just the explosive international appeal that it ended up having, and that was such a great victory, at least on the part of the West, in terms of the Cold War and psyops. I've even cited Pravda articles back under the Soviet Union, where the Soviets would just, they would critique Bond and talk about, how much of a deception it was, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that the Soviets and Pravda in the '60s were good, but yeah. So the irony, though, is that it's all about East German and Russian and Spectre operatives and agents who are spying on everyone. And now that the Atlanticist Anglo-American establishment has gained the upper hand and all that, and kind of stood out on top, uh, we are under the most intense surveillance. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
It's not. It's just ironic. It's so what we. I think what we can gather from that is that statecraft is always power politics, and even though a lot of people, especially the baby boomers and the World War II generation, that really thought that they were fighting for so quote freedom, as if that like operates in a vacuum or something apart from a worldview. Where what does it mean to be free? I mean, that presupposes that you have persons and persons who have wills, and it presupposes an anthropology is what I'm trying to say.
Hmm.
You can't just have a generic philosophy of just fighting for quote freedom. So what does that mean? Does that mean like raping kids, and is there a limit to that, or is it total? Is it Marquis de Sade? What does it mean? So yeah, I think that generation, the baby boomers during the Cold War, it was such an intense period of, it's obvious it's before my time, but from what I can gather from talking to baby boomers, there's not many of them that really are able to break that conditioning. That's as good as a few, as the people that you talk to, right?
Hmm.
But so many of them are just so wrapped up in the propaganda of especially the Western side, and because of military service and all that, and fighting in different wars, that they were just so convinced that well, which our side's the good guys, right?
Hmm.
And the reality of the world is that in geopolitics, it's not black and white. It's not we're us good guys, them bad guys. I mean, there's bad guys on both sides, and there's some good guys on both sides, right? And that's just to me, it seems just obvious realpolitik. That's how the world is, but so Bond and Fleming and those things, that they function as partly as propaganda tools. They function. I mean, there's a lot of different usages for it. It's partly the first attempts at real product placement, um, and they were very successful with selling vodka through the shaken not stirred situation, and different Aston Martin, the Walter PPK, and all these different things. It worked like wildfire. So it's not all one thing. Is it predictive programming? Absolutely. It's all these things. It's a vast array, and that's why Bond is so fascinating, because it's not just advertising material. He's not just a caricature. He's not just propaganda and psyops. He's also kind of iconic of, I guess, the nihilistic end result of Western civilization that's kind of lost its way, I guess.
Yeah, because he is kind of in his own way, a lost soul. He,
He is. He's an orphan,
yeah.
and he's hurt by the women in his life that he loved. He loved Vesper Lynd, and Vesper Lynd deceived him. And that was his last attempt at actually finding a human connection. And so he becomes a soulless killing machine.
License to
And
Kill. Yeah.
and that's what he operates as. He's a killing machine who doesn't feel bad for what he does. And when he discusses the morality of what he does, throughout the novels, it's like a Manichaean, Nietzschean sort of will to power type thing. It's just like, well, why not fight for queen and country? Well, that's the state's what gives me my livelihood.
Hmm.
So queen and country, those are kind of the stand-ins for Bond's father and mother archetype.
Which is kind of funny because if you get into trauma-based mind control and what
Oh
they,
yeah, you
yeah,
could definitely say that
well, not
Bond is
funny. I'm sorry, disturbing,
right.
but funny in a way, interesting.
You
Yeah.
could definitely say he's traumatized, and that was actually even brought up in Skyfall, the most recent installation of the Bond series, where that was kind of Judi Dench's character is his matriarch figure because he's an orphan, and that's roughly applicable to the novels. Although there's M is not a woman in the novels, and there's no Judi Dench character, but Queen is the stand-in for that as well. This absentee woman you never actually see or meet, but you're going to give your life for.
Hmm. Now, have you done anything? I've always heard that the Bond character is roughly based on Sidney Riley.
There's a whole bunch.
Yeah.
So, what you read a whole bunch of the secondary literature on this, what you'll find out is that everybody's got a thesis
Yeah.
as to
Yeah.
who it's based on. And so, what I think is that probably Fleming, is kind of based it on a bunch of people, like even Elizabethan era British people.
Yeah. John Dee. Yeah.
And not just John Dee, but there's another one, and the name escapes me at the moment, but it's whoever said the famous quote, "The world's not enough." That's actually some British noble person at some point who
Okay. That's
was
interesting.
alive. And so he's believed to be kind of an early inspiration, maybe John Dee with the 007 thing, and then you've got all these people contemporary with Fleming who might be like Maxwell Knight, and he was also a British intelligence guy involved in the occult. Yeah. So, and then, as you point out, there's other candidates as well, and of course Fleming himself is
Yeah.
of
Of
an
course.
obvious contender there too.
And it's, of course, a very flattering imagery of it's Fleming kind of, hey, look what we're like.
Well, he was kind of
Yeah.
a dapper, dandy, playboy type character.
Well, Roald
And
Dahl, right?
Roald Dahl too. Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely.
He was forced to sleep with Claire Booth Luce.
Exactly. Roald Dahl actually racked up quite a few.
Yeah, but in the book The Irregulars, there's an account where he's actually complaining to his superiors about, I guess you can say, Claire Booth Luce's stamina or
Mm.
demands in bed,
Hmm.
and 'cause she was like 13 years older than he was or something, and so I guess you know how that is, right? I'm not saying, you know what that means, right?
I understand.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
His superiors told him just to close his eyes and think of England.
Yeah, I remember that. I do because I read about Roald Dahl, and yeah, he would. Yeah, he was quite a lady killer for sure, and Fleming, I think, was supposed to be sort of early on, kind of in his college period at Eton, I believe.
And Fleming had played no small role in the formation of the U.S. intelligence establishment community with with the OSS, right? That kind of is based on the designs of
It was. There were other prominent British intelligence agents that also would meet with Bill Donovan and helping to set up this nascent OSS situation. But yeah, according to Andrew Lycett in his
Mhm.
sort of mainline, well-known biography, that Fleming was one of those characters that put in his advice to Donovan. And see, if Fleming was from a wealthy family, and but his father was a banker, and they were running in a lot of these noble circles. I believe Anne is his wife. I believe she was of nobility, if I recall. And so, he's running around hanging out with Aristotle and Assis and all these, big players. So he knows how the world really works, is what
Yeah.
I'm trying to say. And that's how he can go, interview LA police detectives on smuggling operations, and then he writes Diamonds Are Forever, and he actually writes a nonfiction book about diamond smuggling too. So yeah, he and a lot of these exploits are based on real black ops, as I've said many times, and he played directly into Operation Mincemeat. He was in the background of the Enigma machine, cracking the code operation, although his plan for what to do, the Enigma machine was actually a failure. That one didn't work out. But he would organize all kinds of psyops. It's really a fascinating story.
Um, I've always heard one of the aspects of the Bond phenomenon, at least the movie franchise, was that it came out roughly the same time as the Kim Philby scandal and the
Exactly.
Cambridge Five, and that's centered around let's just say there was a homosexual ring, sex
Hmm.
scandal involved in that, and the idea of Bond being put forth as this alpha male. Was that compensation? Was that anything to that? Okay.
That's an interesting point. I have a lot of books on secondary scholarly treatments of all of this, and you will find in the scholars discussion of that kind of stuff. And I find the whole Cambridge Five story is fascinating as well. You can even Malcolm Muggeridge. Malcolm Muggeridge actually was British intelligence as well,
Yeah. Huh.
and he has discussed this. And then there's discussions of whether Lord Rothschild, who was working for British intelligence, was actually working for the Soviets. But I kind of think, well, he's working both sides, so right? Like he's not either one.
It's like,
And
yeah, that level, come on.
yeah, right. And so yeah, the whole history of British intelligence is just a big, huge, crazy labyrinth. It's wild. And I'm by no means any kind of expert on it, but I do love researching it. And so. Was it compensate? Yeah, it could be, man. That's a great angle on it, and some people do talk about that. But I don't know how far that was in Ian Fleming's mind, but it certainly could be.
But definitely by the time the movies were coming out,
Mm-hmm.
because the movies popularized it in a way that no way that books ever could, because people just don't read. So the movies,
exactly.
and you're looking at Ursula Andress in a conch shell and bikini. That's far more. It's an attention getter right there, right?
More so than a pulp dime store novel.
Yeah, exactly. So,
but that would be a great thing to explore more in that regard. And I really love the conversation that you had with Mark Hackard, where you guys talked about his excellent essay, Great Betrayal. And Mark hits on a lot of great points there about the decline of British Empire, and it's
the Philbies, yeah. Whereas he was a scion of the establishment, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
A very corrupt establishment.
He's sort of an exemplar of what was an empty ideology to begin with. So was it really Kim Philby that was the betrayal? Well, yeah, in one sense, but ultimately it was kind of the ideology of the British Empire for the last several hundred years that's a betrayal.
Yeah. Was it I did it for king, country, and club, I think how you phrase it.
Right.
Yeah.
And you would have those clubs at the Oxford and Eton and Cambridge, and that's where obviously British intelligence would recruit from generally. And a lot of those guys would have, was it the Apostles and the X Club?
Yeah.
And some of those guys were homosexual too, and they were having their little shindigs going on. And
Lytton Strachey.
Yeah, it was very common thing amongst not just British nobility, but misogyny is called the royal vice, right?
Yeah,
noble vice, right?
There's a story of Lytton Strachey where during World War One they were opposed to the British involvement, or they were opposed to World War One, or the British war effort. And he was Lytton Strachey. He was leader of the Apostles at Cambridge.
Mm-hmm.
He was an avowed homosexual, out of the closet homosexual in that day. And I think his interlocutor asked him, "What would you do if a German soldier came to rape your sister?" And his response was, "I should try to come between them."
Gross.
It's like, jeez.
Yeah, yeah, and Alan Turing was got in trouble for like exposing himself or touching some boy or something.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, he's working with British intelligence on cracking the Enigma code.
Oh, well, pedophilia and intelligence, they go hand in hand. So, unfortunately.
And I believe I saw this was in the tabloids, so I don't know how trustworthy this is. You can't really trust British tabloids. Every now and then, tabloids do put out stuff that nobody else will touch. But there was that building where all this stuff with Heath and these British PMs was going down, where the MI5 was involved,
Oh, where like spying on them?
No, like where the prostitution and the
okay,
child prostitution was going on with these people. There was a certain building, the name escapes me at the moment, but some locale that was like flophouse type thing.
Well, that's very similar to things in the United States, with the Franklin scandal.
It is, but what I'm getting at is that supposedly it's a flophouse that Burgess frequented.
Oh, Guy Burgess. Okay, yeah, okay.
I believe that's or McLean, whichever one was
Anthony
sort
Blunt, Guy Burgess, Donald McLean.
yeah, whichever one was the more known
I forget. Yeah.
homosexual one. But supposedly he was like hanging out at the same flop house that the Saville and these characters were hanging out
Oh,
at.
okay. Well, there you go. Yeah. Them. But so we're getting into the media fakery, stagecraft as statecraft, and we have examples of that in U.S. history. Well, one of the most famous episodes was the Orson Welles War of the Worlds broadcast, 1938, and as a form of predictive programming for the coming of the World War. A lot of people think it was a way to kind of prepare the nation for that. Hollywood was already very much involved, or at least British intelligence, SOE, Special Operation Executive, was already very much working with Hollywood to produce movies like Gunga Din and these things to put a British positive spin on the British Empire. All this was conditioning. But there's been some recent research regarding Orson Welles. A lot of people, the traditional story with War of the Worlds is that they did the broadcast and unknowingly, or at least they didn't plan to cause this, fear in the listeners. But millions of people, thought it was real. And there's the Radio Research Project, which is a Rockefeller-funded project running, I think, out of Princeton, would look into mass effects on society through the media. And they would study things like soap operas. At the time, they called like daytime dramas, I think they were called then.
Mm-hmm.
But recent research has unveiled. Jan Irvin did a recent series on this, and he's done research. He went over to Princeton, and according to him, he says that he's got the goods on it. He thinks he's found out that that whole thing was planned.
I've thought that for a long time.
Yeah.
I'm not denigrating his claims or anything. I think it's good that he's doing that. But I thought, like I said before, that Hadley Cantrell wrote a book, Invaders from Mars, and he was kind of one of these psychological engineer type persons.
And he was at Princeton, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
so he wrote about it, and yeah, I mean, Global Research has had different articles over the years talking about that, and yeah, I've always thought it pretty obviously was, and I've watched a lot of Orson Welles' films, and I've got a biography on him that's kind of mainstream, so I don't really know how good that one is for digging up details and whatnot, research. But yeah, I mean, it's just you're not going to be able to go into RKO radio and RKO pictures and not be under the influence of the Rockefellers and these big oligarchs. It's just not going to happen. And they were all set up. It was all originally one conglomerate anyway, right before you had, or there were two, I think, before you had the division into CBS, NBC, and ABC.
And of course, ABC and CBS. I think it was CBS. William Perley was part of OSS, I believe, during the war. And starting off ABC, he was with OWI, which is Office of War Information, which is psychological warfare during the war. But regarding the again back to this War of the Worlds.
Yeah, that's the thing to remember is that the rise of radio, television, and these things is military warfare.
Yeah,
exactly, with internet and iPhones and cell phones.
Because the ARPA now came out of DARPA.
They come out of all of that world.
But even the Frank Stanton, a researcher from CBS, helped with the project. He wanted to become president of CBS. He even involved the Tavistock Institute, according to this.
There you go. Right.
And that's on Wikipedia. All things Wikipedia. But I'm saying that's his basic information. And of course, Tavistock, which is psychological warfare out of Great Britain. If you look at what was going on at the time, late 30s, the coming of war, and this whole idea of how you could get people frightful, fearful, and just through this broadcast, they took strong notice of.
Right.
And they also, sorry, go ahead.
Why wouldn't they?
Yeah. Well, there's this whole thing. They also did research on the 440 hertz, the 430 to 432 hertz.
Yeah, I thought there's probably something to that.
And that was around 1940 that they introduced the 440 worldwide hertz as a standard. Or was it maybe a decade later that they did that? But when you get into this, again, you're getting into this whole idea of, sort of media fakery, false reality, how they can change, the political conditions to achieve their objective. But here we have the You have what was that point I was going to make here? What we're dealing with here with this, whether it's radio, media, it's kind of you're trying to mediate the culture through control of, you've done a lot on Hollywood and the movies. Even others have done things, with music, and that
Right.
even medicine.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Food, medicine, entertainment, education, culture. If you look at the whole formation of what we call, allopathic or modern medicine, and how basically it's a cartel that are established by Rockefeller interest in
Absolutely.
the 20th century.
Right.
And if you look at the effects of that, and of course the downstream profits with that, and how they control how people, care for their bodies or seek medical help, medicine became all petroleum based. you know.
Yes, and there's a fascinating history of the DuPonts and all that as well, getting into the transition out of hemp and into plastics and into chemical substances everywhere, and there's a lot of truth to all that, absolutely. And the fakery of the drug war, which I think you and I have touched on that in
Yeah.
the past.
But again, this is this concept of full spectrum dominance, which
Right.
another
Yeah.
term is called synarchy, which I think is an interesting term.
Yeah, and I believe that's even used in the occult circles.
hmm Of course, then we get into the weird why all this is going on, and I mentioned this from the beginning of the interview is well, you have to understand the weird and wacky. You have to. This is kind of difficult for me because I always consider myself, normal.
Hmm.
I just don't, get into some of the weirder things. You get into some of this occult practices and some of the secret societies and some of their rituals, and understanding why do they worship an owl at Bohemian Grove, and why are candidates for Skull and Bones forced to lay flat in a sarcophagus and do the things they do. Um, it's all part of occult magic, and
Right.
that's magic with a K. What's the distinction between magic with a K and just magic? I've always heard that distinction.
Well, people generally would use magic with a C for stagecraft. So, David Copperfield, Chris Angel, these guys performing or doing magic, Magic. The dude that wears the silly outfit and
Yeah.
walks around the streets of Vegas and has this deck of cards and he's got a sequin vest. That's magic, supposedly. The magic with a CK is ceremonial magic or ritual magic, which would be the technique or process of utilizing ritual ceremony and magical orders and different traditions or whatever, and then paraphernalia to bring about some effect in the world based on the individual's will to affect change in the world. And that might be done through, invoking believed deities or spirits, or the coven working in unison, or, there's different theories and beliefs and practices and all that. But the general approach here is to presume that the spiritual realm works like a technology that you can tap into and affect change in the world through the assistance of higher spiritual beings, forces, entities, whatever.
Now, when you talked about the idea of wanting to be duped, what was the term you used again? The duper?
Well, the guys over at Hoaxbusters have titled, and I don't think it's there as a term. I think it's that's where I heard it, but it's just a term used to describe the joy that might be had from tricking people.
Mm-hmm.
Dupe's delight.
Okay, the duper. But as far as how about those who want to be duped?
Duped delight.
Dupe delight. Yeah, dupe delight. Is it because people are ignorant, or they just find it easier to accept the fairy tale?
Laziness, ignorance, desire to fit in, cognitive dissonance, cognitive bias, all those things.
I know you were in that marathon interview you did with them recently,
Mm-hmm.
with Hoaxbusters. He brought up a number of issues, and a lot of these things are contentious points, but about media fakery, and this would be,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
again, we're talking about Hollywood. We all know that the intelligence agencies supposedly help Hollywood.
Absolutely.
Okay, same with the military.
Absolutely.
But you and some others have come up with the idea that the relationship goes the other way, meaning that Hollywood helps the intelligence agencies, helps the
Oh, yeah.
media fake things. And with the
Absolutely.
advent of CGI, which I think you've pointed out is a military development, technology came out of
Yeah. Pentagon, right?
right, and so they're able to fake reality. And of course, I think they fake things before the age of CGI. I think the
Oh, yeah.
controversy regarding Stanley Kubrick and the moon landing, which I think responsibly said in one of your articles, for which there is much evidence. Right, you're kind of being reserved in your judgment on that because I simply don't know. I just know that there's some interesting. So we say,
Well,
yeah,
okay, maybe I was being lazy there or
yeah,
something. I don't know, but you can find you can find pieces. This was like 6 years ago when I wrote the original piece on that, and
okay,
I did find you can find Kubrick working with NASA.
yeah,
He did openly. The Air Force was interested in his work. Uh, you can find photos of him, hanging out with Arthur C. Clarke and NASA people.
hmm,
Arthur C. Clarke gave a lecture that I cited in that where he talked about all this as well. So yeah, NASA's an arm of Hollywood as well. Hollywood is an arm of NASA.
hmm. And of course,
That's why Ridley Scott just said that The Martian was timed. The release of the Mars quote mission was timed with the release of this dumb movie.
and we've brought up earlier how James Cameron is now directing this latest Mars mission, right?
There was in the news a few months ago that Cameron was going to quote direct the Mars mission, and supposedly he backed out of it. But
Oh,
that
okay.
tells you everything you need to know right there.
The story. It's an interesting story because there is a much there with Kubrick, where I guess the Pentagon was very impressed with his
Yeah,
work on Doctor Strangelove.
right,
So they came to him, and I think the story goes, and this is one way they say it might have went down, is they gave him an offer he couldn't refuse.
right.
It says, "You do help us with this, in case it fails, we have this in reserve, or maybe they realized they couldn't do it from the get go, at least not with revealed technology. It gets into occulted, black technology and stuff like
Hmm.
that. It's a whole other topic. But it says, you help us with this, and you'll never want for money for any of your movie projects."
Hmm.
And of course, once you get an offer like that, you can't say no, thank you, right? Because
Especially if you're a director, because your main
yeah,
issue is finding money, right?
if you look at his contract was odd. He was the only director ever to have complete editor rights on all his movies.
Uh,
At least that's what.
I've heard there's a handful that have carte blanche.
Okay, maybe I'm mistaken, but
I've heard Tarantino has it.
okay.
So certain guys get that when you're at a certain level where they know your movies,
But
gonna, hundreds of millions of
yeah,
dollars.
but his movies were never. I mean, they weren't blockbusters, right? I mean, they weren't big money makers, were they? I mean, were they?
It's an interesting question. I thought 2001 did well, but
It wasn't like Star Wars or Jaws or things like that, Right? So,
yeah, they're not like billion-dollar makers. I
yeah.
don't think. Right.
Another thing was the ability to use that lens for his movie, that period piece he did in the '70s, with Ryan O'Neal.
Oh, you're talking about Barry Lyndon?
Barry Lyndon, yeah.
Yeah.
This $1 million lens or something that.
Oh yeah, yeah. I forgot about that. Yeah, the expensive lens,
Yeah.
right? And yeah, and then you were talking about they were impressed with the front screen
Front screen
projection,
projection, which with Jay Weidner thinks is
Weidner stuff,
yeah,
right?
and there's a good. I mean, if you look at it is. I mean, I've watched his movies, his analysis, and there are things I
Hmm.
wouldn't think of looking at until he pointed out to me, and I said, well, yeah, he is right about it. Look at all the images on the moon and all that. They're all kind of shot in that way.
They do look like front screen projection. Yeah.
And then you have the fact that NASA claimed to lose all the original high definition footage.
Well, just look at the fact that NASA, again, I don't know. I keep pointing this out, but I don't. Maybe people don't think it's a very good argument. I think it is, but like I said, since high school, they've been saying they've been finding alien life. Since I remember walking through the halls of high school in
Yeah.
1995 or six, and it was a big deal that NASA found water or quote life on Mars, and of course this is never pans out. It's always it gets forgotten, and then 6 months later they say again. And then you have all these astronauts, and they all talk about aliens, and NASA was obviously involved in SETI, SETI for a long time, and now supposedly they don't care about SETI anymore. And I mean, it's too ridiculous even to care that much about, honestly, because what do you're never going to get to the truth, I don't think, by even going down the road of all that. And that doesn't mean, I think NASA doesn't do anything. I think they do a lot of things, but I think their main function is propaganda, so that's one main role they have. And there's just so much absurdity around NASA that I don't, and you hear these stories about astronauts dying, and I mean, who knows what's true.
That was the Gus Grissom story with Chafee and White, where Gus Grissom was reportedly a harsh critic of the whole project, saying it's never going to fly, we can't communicate, and then his capsule burns up, and they found very high cyanide levels that couldn't be justified by the fire, apparently. And of course, then the person investigating that provided the report. He's killed in a strange fiery car crash.
Yeah.
And of course, Gus Grissom's son today claims that his father was murdered, and his son is an airline pilot, flies 747s or something. So that's something. But when I talk again, I don't come out on any side of this really, because I really, frankly, I don't know for sure. I can't say I know for sure. I do have my suspicions, because if you look at it, if you just wipe the slate clean and say, give me the evidence, and they can't manifest the evidence, all they have are their statements or their claims, and a TV show that they put on with the CBS, with Walter Cronkite, who's always trustworthy, right?
And who I said that he'd rather work with the devil. Right?
Yeah, exactly. I asked, when I even broached the topic, I said, I just asked the questions to people. They say, what are you talking about? I saw it on television. I said, well, how do you know it occurred? It's because I saw it on television. So what you're saying is because you saw it on television, you know it happened.
Yeah, it's in that Clinton biography too.
Yeah, which gets back to what about fakery, just because you see something on television, But even I think the Hoaxbuster guy also brought up some of the imagery of 9/11, which I have trouble reconciling in my own mind. I have to come up with an answer, because I simply don't know. Based on my understanding of physics, Royal Society physics, as you might say, it's very hard to explain some of the things we all saw.
Well, okay, that doesn't mean, by the way, that like the basics of Newtonian physics at our level of reality isn't true.
Yeah, I know. I'm just saying.
Right.
Is there something else? Is there something else going on? I'm talking exotic technology or something that. But there are. I think your host there talked about. When I think it's a valid point. I don't know what it means. I don't call me nuts for asking questions. It looks really weird how that plane interacts with the building when it collides with it.
I agree. It does look weird, and I don't know what to make of that. I don't know
what to make of that. I know there's disputes even within people who believe there's fakery.
Right. Sure.
So it's hard to say, and a lot of,
Go ahead. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I'm just thinking. Don't call me insane for looking at an obvious situation. Does aluminum cut through reinforced concrete and steel traveling at 500? Can a plane travel 500 miles an hour at that? Under my understanding, I look it up neutrally. I've always understood it at that level. Planes cannot get at that velocity. This is why a jet takes off so fast.
Mm-hmm.
At that level, that speed would cause the plane to crash.
Yeah, and there's that weird sort of round-looking middle section to the plane that doesn't look right.
So this, is this something that's put in to screw us up, screw with our brains even more?
Could be. I wonder too. Maybe, maybe film at that time. Like if you look at old lower resolution videos that are uploaded, like 240 and 360.
Yeah.
There's those little boxy kind of glitchy looks to them. So could that be involved? I don't know. Maybe could these
shutter speed type thing?
Could these images have been manipulated too?
Yeah. Because basically the vast majority of people experienced 9/11 on the television.
Exactly.
And judge from our other research, from our other discussions, and other people's research, is we all know that the networks are all in bed with the intelligence agencies. They're all one and the same. They all came out of the intelligence agency.
Totally, yeah. That's the world they arise from.
Yeah. You have that issue. Remember that helicopter that's filming? Is it the South Tower or the North Tower? I get those two confused. But the plane collides with it. Of course, you see the nose come through the other end.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But the way that camera. That's edited, because when we saw it was edited, we saw the close-up image of it. We see the plane just come through the corner of the screen.
Yeah.
The pan-back views, you don't see any plane.
Yeah, I have looked at these all these
Yeah.
clips that show all this, right?
No,
And
I'm just saying it's
I came
interesting.
away from it just I don't know what to make of this.
Exactly.
Like I don't know.
And this is where we're looking into these things. Is there are some matters that certainty is going to be denied to us this side of paradise. I think.
Right.
I mean, we'll never really know, and I don't think it's a reason to point fingers at someone, accuse someone of being a cognitive infiltrator or being insane, just for raising these questions or to coming to some conclusions. I do think some people are too quick to come to a conclusion on it. You know?
Yeah, I tend to think that you can fake whole planes. I mean, I don't know for sure what went down in that situation,
Yeah.
but like MH17, I don't even know if there was an MH17.
Well, how do we know? There's no. I mean, it just disappears, and
You see an image on the news
yeah,
of like what's supposed to be a couple pieces of a wing and
yeah.
maybe some luggage lying around. I
And
mean,
we hear people talk about plane crashes, even when they crash in the sea. There's a sea of debris because most of the plane floats.
right.
It's going to be bobbling up and so, what do you make of that?
Well, and how easy could a plane fakery be staged? I mean, there's a whole episode of BBC Sherlock about that I pointed out in my essay back at the time
Mm-hmm.
that perfectly seems to mirror the MH317 scenario.
Yes.
And the BBC Sherlock series episode came out prior to the MH, well, both of the MH fiascos.
Mm-hmm. And of course, we were dealing with the questions of eyewitnesses, and this also deals with the situation at the Pentagon, where you have this total lack of debris, and they claim the plane went all the way through the building and punched to the other side with the nose punch, which
Well, that's just obviously not true, even for the pictures they release.
yeah. They claim the plane disintegrated, but they identified the victims by their fingerprints.
And the other plane that crashed,
Oh yeah, Pennsylvania.
there's all I ever saw was a couple pieces of stuff laying around and like a hole.
A hole in the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Hole in one.
Doesn't look like a plane.
No, it does not. But think that's the cognitive dissonance. Where you're presented with something where they've done studies that with not in regard to 9/11, but just other topics where you get a crowd of people to say something to look at an image, and the image is obviously not what it is, but everyone in that crowd starts saying what it is, and the people who are dissenting eventually give in and say, "Yes, I see it now."
Well, or the one where it's the joke and everyone's in on this situation where the mark is not told, and so somebody tells something that's not a joke, and everyone laughs, and then the other guy starts laughing.
Yeah, just to fit in.
Yeah.
And of course, this gets in your essay. IQ psyops.
And the civilization of the scam.
Yeah, this is well, I think I had a quote here. I thought it was cognitive dissonance. I'll quote you if you bear with me, and then you can comment on it. You wrote it. Cognitive dissonance is the firewall that exists in most minds when confronted with a challenge to their basic beliefs about the world, as it is human nature to avoid admitting being in error or having been duped. For most humans, the ego zealously flees the admission to oneself of the significance of error. A challenge to our worldviews or paradigms of beliefs are also quite jarring. They can unsettle our comfortable existence and lead us to question everything we held dear, and might even lead to psychological or spiritual crisis when the consideration of being fundamentally in error is on the table. And you point out is the people that are most subject to that are the people who are considered the smartest people.
Quite often, yeah, because they have the most invested in the system with 10 years of medical school or law school and $100,000, $200,000 of debt, and then they're imprisoned to whatever their chosen career field is, and they can't dare to look bad amongst these people and believe or question, because it would break the whole paradigm down.
Mm-hmm. And they have the most to lose, yeah.
And they are the engine of the establishment, right?
Mm-hmm. And this is interesting because this is brings to mind a book by Daryl Hamamoto.
Yeah.
He talks about this. Of course, I think he focuses on Asian Americans.
Mm-hmm.
How what's it called again? Something of empire. What's the book? not agents of empire. So anyway, basically,
Yeah, I've heard the interviews. I know what you're talking about.
yeah, and how they're being recruited into these corporations, and they're going to become the doctors and the scientists who are going to implement sort of this Agenda 21 scenario.
Yes, and they
vaccines
will
and stuff
completely
like that.
go along with it because they're from a culture and a situation where you don't question any of that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a virtue to do that. It's not a virtue to think that way. And I'm not a fan of atomism, but the West has been. It is good that the West has had that tradition of not blindly believing government.
Yeah, well, it's a balance.
It is.
You got to balance this, and also you have to is atomism in regards to what the collective. Obviously, the highest political, the highest morality of politics, you could say, is the individual. But
well, I believe in a balance of the one and the many.
Yeah,
and that would be ultimately based on the theological views that I have. So absolutely.
I did an interview with David Wemhoff. He was talking about this radical individualism. About Henry Luce Empire preaching Americanism, and part of it was to undermine the influence of the Catholic Church.
Absolutely, and that's why there was an encyclical by Leo the 13th, even prior to that, critiquing Americanism.
Mm-hmm. And his idea was to undermine the American Catholic Church and become an exponent of Americanism, and that
it is.
Yeah,
and that's even Solange Hertz has a book on that.
And the best way I can encapsulate his thesis is what happens by weakening this radical interpretation of separation of church and state, which isn't even in the Constitution. It's in a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote, and it's a nice. I think I mean, obviously, in a society with multiple religions and a polyglot society, you have to have some sort of religious tolerance. So you can have peace and order in that society. Yeah. But at the same time,
go ahead.
You need to have this idea that religion should be expelled from the public square, create what the naked public square, I think it was John Newhouse called it, Father John Newhouse called it. But by destroying the influence of the church militant, as some people say, is you deny the people of some sort of corporate representation. And they become these atomized individuals who are then naked before these oligarchs and ruling elite.
Yeah, it would be a revolution in cope and tiara.
Yeah.
And that's what happened, and that's why the Syllabus of Errors condemns the separation of church and state. That's why Pacendi Dominici Gracious of Pius X says exactly the same thing. Quas Primas of Pius XI says it, and then you have the complete reversal of that with the Peritus and Peritae of Vatican II and John XXIII hanging out with the worker priests and all that, and he calls the council, and then everything is revolutionized.
Mm-hmm. And some people think that what happened was these agents, these Catholic quislings, as E. Michael Jones calls them, were sent in, representing Rockefeller interests and all that too.
They were. That's all. I believe.
John Courtney Murray. Yeah.
I've read. John Courtney Murray and the Murrays go back as a long time in the U.S. Catholic family, and they were always very influenced by, the Carrolls go back, and they were always influenced by Americanism and the ideas of Americanism. And you can find precedents for that in Robert Bellarmine. Bellarmine has a treatise on government and how you can have Catholic democracy. There's also Leo XIII talks about the possibility of Christian democracy, and they talk about it as a possibility, but they frown upon it. It's obviously it's all part of the revolutionary tradition, and so it's just you have this gradual erosion of the Roman tradition on this matter, over several centuries, going back to Clement's original encyclicals dealing with Masonry back in the 1700s.
And of course, the Freemasonry, you have the infiltration of the church by Freemasons.
Yeah, openly.
Yeah, open. That's with with the propaganda or P2 propaganda due, and that involved the Vatican.
Alta Vendita, and prior to that too, by the way. Yeah, there were cardinals and such bishops that were involved in that kind of stuff prior to the 1800s.
And I think this also gets into for some reason or the CIA targeted the Catholic Church
Yeah, as I understand, they
Yeah.
met with the popes at various periods during the Cold War and convinced them to sign on. Bill Casey would meet with John Paul II, and under the auspices of fighting the Cold War, and so I don't have proof of this. I've just always speculated that a lot of this pedophilia stuff is, like we said, I think we've talked about it before, is
Yep.
the blackmail of intelligence agencies of the papacy.
And how you can get involved and corrupt people within the Vatican and take over the, and that's a definite. I mean, that's obviously there's much.
Cardinal Villot, Villot,
Mm-hmm.
was reportedly either Grand Orient or OTO. So
Wow.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah,
And you have Bishop Marcinkus out of Chicago
mm-hmm.
and his control of the Vatican Bank and how. Well, a lot of it was the interest of the church itself at the time. Needed there were the church just has a lot of assets, but they're always cash poor because they're not liquid. And so what happened was he was basically, I think the bank was used as a clearinghouse or a money laundering operation. Says you can have that liquidity going through your bank. That makes your job a lot easier as God's banker, as he's referred to in that book. So that's how he got corrupted in that. But it's just interesting that Mercinkus would come out of Chicago and some,
Yeah, this is a whole world that
yeah,
people know about, and then in the conspiracy realm, there's all this dumb stuff that's people don't have any idea what they're talking about.
like
Just
Jesuits ruling the world.
based on just evangelical apologetics stuff that's not they don't have a clue what they're talking about. But yeah, and the Jesuits did though, however, lead the way in the revolution in the church for sure.
But this, Chris, when you say this about a whole like subculture or underworld operating, this gets back to your in Magus, right? The Magus, where this guy, this whole thing, got this whole other world going on. And people know nothing about it, and
Yes, the Vatican's the world's oldest intelligence agency.
yeah,
So you would think if you wanted to learn about geopolitics and espionage and how the world works, you would actually get a handle on maybe the history of the Catholic Church and not from not from the stupid apologetics of the Seventh Day Adventists, which is where a lot of this nonsense stuff comes from, which they don't know anything. But so yeah, you have to really dig into real historical works and real historians, and there's a lot of good Catholic historians. There's a lot of good stuff out there. But it's just a world that people don't know about, and I didn't know. I grew up as Baptist in the South, and so it's a world I had absolutely no knowledge of until I got into it, and it is fascinating. Even though I don't go that route anymore. It's still very fascinating, and obviously a big part of geopolitics. Especially when we look at Bergoglio and his history and his situation, which I don't see how anyone who has any sort of I'm not attacking you personally or anything like or trying to start a debate. I'm just giving my opinion on the matter from my perspective, and I just don't see how anybody could really, if you're a person who believes traditional Catholic teaching, could not just be kind of spinning in your seat right now with Bergoglio.
Oh, there are a lot of Catholics spinning.
Yes, I have kind of off and on kept up with that world since I wasn't in it, but yeah, and I've got a lot of Catholic friends, so yeah.
And there's different reasons for their. Yeah, I mean, there's some people who look askance at his role down in Argentina, and I don't know, how apparently he was working with the government. And
I don't see him as some sort of like when he first got elected. Some people were castigating him as like this black ops, like far right, death squad guy or something.
Yeah.
To me, he looks like a total liberation theology guy.
Could that be part of that false left-right dialectic we're forced to believe in?
I think so.
The Borgias can have their popes,
And it was the liberation theologians who influenced a lot of the Vatican II Peritae.
Mm-hmm. So, but this
many of whom were Jesuit.
But this gets into this, I guess, the broader topic of this false left-right paradigm and the false political world the superficial political world that that's retailed to us in the mainstream media, and just what it's almost like we're in Disneyland, and we're on the rides, and we're
exactly
told to believe that it's real, but it isn't. We really are almost like an amusement park.
It is. Yeah, we live in Disneyland, right?
And again, and what's frustrating about it is it doesn't require too much effort to scratch, the surface and find a completely different world operating. Not
Yeah,
doesn't to
somebody
say,
said you start pulling the wallpaper and you actually find out that there's like,
yeah,
the whole thing just falls apart, like your whole wall's eaten out, right?
yeah, and none of this is, whether it's political, none of this is discussed, and this is where all the decisions are taken. I mean, I was if you, I was looking at what was, I had a recent discussion with Graham McQueen regarding the anthrax attacks
Hmm.
and how they were directed at Congress, and of course his theory is came out of the U.S. governments to intimidate Congress. And I wanted to bring this up, but I ran out of time. But it says, well, what this tells us is this is what, when you're being taught civics, how laws are made, how policy is driven,
Hmm.
what decisions are taken, it isn't the deliberative process. It isn't elections. It's who's being blackmailed, whose plane is blown up, and who's being threatened. And that's really how the world works.
Yeah.
And it's not as if you and I, I think what happens is we live in a country where it's been relatively peaceful. But at what price? What's going on? And this gets into your review of the book. You did. I didn't mention surgery, but the movie you did. The movie was it? Sorry, was it The Box?
Yes.
The Box. And the idea you press a button and you get $1 million, but somewhere out there someone dies.
You're gonna kill somebody. Yeah.
You're gonna kill somebody. I read the review. At the time when I saw the movie, I was even more ignorant of esoteric stuff, occult stuff then than I am now. I'm still pretty ignorant. I'm just, just as you look into these, you're kind of forced to look into these things to understand them. But when I took away from it is that's kind of like how Americans live. Is they have a
I
lifestyle.
think Richard Kelly is partly saying that
Yeah.
with the film. He's partly saying, we kind of live in this world where the trade-off that we think that the world tells us is there out there for us, this false American dream, this trade-off of you can get whatever you want, just be willing to go to whatever lengths are necessary, including killing somebody. And don't worry, you're not going. You can. The guy in the Air Force trailer can sit there and push the button,
Yeah.
and the drone will take him out. You don't have to worry about it. You'll reap the benefits, which actually isn't true. You don't reap the benefits of all these wars. Halliburton and the different defense contractors.
It's a false bargain. Yeah.
Yeah, you get the GMO food, and you get to choose Coke or Pepsi.
Yeah, and that's the false choice. Exactly. We have more choices of ice cream than we do of presidential candidates in this country.
Well put.
Yeah, and pithy way to look at it. But it is because really that's not the choice. We're not. That's the false choice they give us, because really our world, if we did live by peaceful, honest friendship and peaceful commerce, would be wealthy by several times over. Much more wealthy, because human capital would be unleashed.
I tend to go back to, you look at something like, and I'm not trying to be a moralist and preachy guy. I mean, I certainly have my faults, but, you go back to something like the Ten Commandments, and even if you don't believe in things in a religious perspective, you look at the morality presented there.
Yeah.
And it makes sense how you could have a functioning society that way.
It goes back. Well, the rule that you learn, the rule, like the sandbox rules. Don't mess with other people's toys and don't hurt people. But that simple message lessons people forget as they get, as they become more sophisticated.
And isn't that the whole? You read through the Law and the Prophets. That's the whole history of Israel.
Yeah.
That's what we're supposed to learn from that. Is you fall into corruption and all these practices, including all these occult practices. I mean, that's everywhere in the Old Testament.
And demanding a king.
Well, I'm going to have to disagree with you on that one there.
Okay, well, that's a topic for another discussion. And that's
and I'm not trying to be a hard ass on that. I realize that.
Aren't they told that they'll be oppressed or something if they get their king or something?
Well, my view of that is that you have in Genesis 49, I think, the promise of the line of David, who will be a king from who will rule with a scepter, right? Mm-hmm. And this is later the prophecy, messianic prophecies are about the Davidic king and so forth. And when the Israelites are requesting a king, they say explicitly that they want a king after the nations,
Hmm.
and the king after the nations I've always taken from commentaries and things that I've read to be a king in the sense of these sort of quasi-divine rulers, and that's what the neighbors of the Israelites always viewed their rulers as divine,
Hmm.
and so they would be worshipped, and so that's a clear point of contention with the monotheism of Israel. So, but I've never taken it to be a case where it was. I know a lot of people do, and I understand the argument there. But I think we see different periods in Israel's history where they have judges, they have representative government, they have the constitutional monarchy, they have the hereditary monarchy. So different situations arise, but you have plenty of statements throughout Proverbs and throughout
Hmm.
the wisdom text that also, as well as the historical texts that affirm legitimacy and advantages of monarchy, and even this is kind of the norm in Catholic tradition as well. Even amongst the theologians who would pose the possibility of alternate forms of government, monarchy is still the norm, until the time of the revolutions. And I know that's a not hard and fast. There's gray area there, and for a long time in the Byzantine perspective, the empire was the norm. So though there's no easy answers on
Yeah.
that matter either. But
Well, you know me, I'm
yeah,
Catholic, so we don't read the Bible. So I let,
yeah. Well, when I was Protestant, before I got into reading Catholic stuff, I thought that was the thing, and
yeah.
because I'd talk to my Catholic friends, and they're like, I don't read the Bible.
We have
What are you
three.
talking about? I'd be like, well, I read the Bible, so I'm awesome. You're not.
Oh, before I let you go tonight, maybe if you can do this quick, you did a great analysis of the Brave New World. It won't let you won't make you restate the analysis, but give us Brave New World. You kind of close out that analysis with a kind of demonstrating how we are now living in the Brave New World. Can you
Mhm.
do a brief summation of that, or is that too much to?
No, I don't. No, not at all. I
Okay.
mean, you've got Huxley, part of this British Royal Society circle, hanging out with all these, people, Fabians, and it ties into all the counterculture stuff. And he writes this in 1932. Some people speculate he actually ripped it off of I think a Hungarian or Polish dude, Stanislav Mankiewicz. I always forget that name, but I don't know if that's true. I haven't researched it, but he's presenting the future dystopia, and there's a lot of Platonic stuff that plays into that, because the dystopia is a dystopia that he says in his lectures any sane person would just you would be insane not to reject it. That's what he says in his Berkeley lecture, right? So he just kind of throws it in your face and says, I'm telling you the future. I'm telling you how it's going to be. I'm telling you reality, and you're all going to buy it because only sane persons reject this. That's what he says, right? And he's coming out of this aristocratic British Darwinian social Darwinism perspective on things, and it's all very eugenics based, but it's not capitalism and it's not communism. It's a mix of the two, and that's what people don't know either. That's why you have the year of our Ford.
Hmm.
That's why you have people named after industrialists as well as Marxists. So that's literally the surnames of the future. Bernard Marx is one of the central characters, as well as people named after, I don't know, like Ford and industrialists and so forth. So he's telling you that it's a dialectic. It's not real. It's fake, in the sense of it being two competing sides of the same coin that lead to the same destination. Two roads that lead to the same destination. And that destination is a completely controlled world state that's supposedly under the dominance of reason and scientism, which is why Huxley says in the introduction to my copy that it's the final revolution. And he's referring there to the historical revolutions, the French Revolution, scientific revolution, so forth. The revolution against tiara and cope, the revolution against crown and altar. So revolution against monarchy has also always been a big part of this Masonic idea here, to install a rational republic and get rid of the idea of constitutional hereditary monarchy. Now, you might disagree there, but that's how I've always seen the revolutionaries, as portraying monarchy as like the ultimate, sin and the worst thing ever. And then now, have there always been problems in the caste system and nobility? Well, yeah, there's problems in any system, right? But anytime these revolutionaries come along, with the thing that they put in is like 10 times worse, and you get all these people dead. And I don't think that that's all propaganda and fake. I think that that's true.
Yeah, I think Bolshevism,
just look around at our country.
Yeah,
right. Look around at our country. We live under the America's Brave New World, and that's what the title for the book comes from The Tempest, and The Tempest seems to talk about the New World, the island of illusions. Is this some sort of Rosicrucian prediction? I don't know. It could be, but
that's interesting because some people think that Shakespeare was Francis Bacon.
Bacon, right? Yeah, I don't know, but if he was, but a lot of weird. There's obviously a lot of Rosicrucian elements in Shakespeare for sure, as well as all those Elizabethan playwrights, Ben Jonson and George Herbert and all them, and Edmund Spencer and so forth. But I have a bunch of analyses of their works too. If anybody's interested, you can search that stuff at Jay's Analysis too. But yeah, so Brave New World is this world socialist control state, and I say socialist because it really is more accurately. They're called world socialist controllers, right? There's 10 world controllers. But they have a reservation where they still maintain the old lifestyle of people. I think it's in New Mexico, if I recall. And so they still allow a few tribes and groups of people to kind of have their old ways. But the rest of the world is under the system of London. And the system of London is, of course, Fabian socialism globally. But as we come to the climax of the novel, we learn that there's actually a breakaway civilization. And that's where the elite go to do whatever they want. So if you figure out the puzzle, and as some of the characters in the novel do, they figure out that, hey, wait a minute, our world socialist controller is actually a big fan of Shakespeare, and he likes to read the Bible. And he reads texts on metaphysics, and when he finds scientists that discover truths about theology, he censors it. So he has a child through natural childbirth. One of the directors does. This is a big scandal because they don't do a natural birth anymore. Everything is done through test tubes, genetic engineering, genetic modification, fake civic religious ceremonies, sort of a pan-denominational thing. So Huxley's telling you there that you have a one-world religion. He's telling you that everybody goes to these really bad movies and just sits and watches these just like crappy action movies like Action Jackson or something.
This was 1932.
In 1932. He's talking about cloning. Right? He's talking about cloning and people being born in test tubes. And they engineer everybody in these test tubes to be certain things. You have a alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon classes, and everybody wears color-coded outfits so that you know your caste. So the irony here, of course, is that all the revolutions were supposed to be the end of the class, oppression, right? Class warfare. And the irony here is that the final revolution installs this world socialist dictatorship that's based on a total caste system that you can never escape from because it's determined by your genetics out of a test tube, right? So you can't make money and rise up in this system. In fact, there's only one mention of a bank in the whole novel. I thought for a while there was no mention, but I did find there's actually one place where there's a bank mention. So, but money's not really part of it. There's not really a need for money because money presupposes commerce and freedom, and you don't have that at all. And everybody takes birth control pills. Everybody you wear a Malthusian belt. It's called the Malthusian belt. and the Malthusian belt regulates what you do in terms of sex. Right, so you have the like, birth control pills on it, and your sterilization pills, and you got your dick pills, your Viagra, I guess you could say, stuff like that. Your Soma that you take to get your drug holiday. So everybody's drugged. That's the other obvious big key point there. But yeah, so the main characters, protagonists, discover that it's all fake. That the world socialist control system is based on scientism, and Mustafa Mond, the world socialist controller, says, "Oh yeah, scientism is yeah, it's just propaganda. By the way, it's not true." That's so. Here's Huxley, one of the brains of the New World Order, telling you that scientism is not true. There you go.
Yeah, because he died.
That's one of my favorite points of this novel, right? Is that the world socialist dictator knows scientism's not true.
Yeah.
He says it's not true, and here's Huxley telling you it's not true, but everyone believes it, and so that the characters say, "What about all the science propaganda that we learned at university?" He says, "Yeah, it's propaganda." They're like, "Oh," they can't believe it, and he says, "Now that you figured it out, we can't let you live amongst the citizens anymore because you'll gossip and get shit started. So we're trucking you off to the island where everybody who's, actually kind of smart and elite just hangs out and paints pictures and, has fun all day." So there you go.
And that's kind of like of course, you've commented on university, this state of academia, and this idea of peer review and getting your PhD through, the PhD committee. All this is designed to. This isn't designed to maintain a standard of scholarship and excellence. It's all there to control.
Yes, as with most things in life, back to Shakespeare, things are not what they appear to be.
Not what they, yeah.
And it's no different in the academic realm for sure. Mm. And what do you think about? What do you think about that? About Brave New World and all that? I mean, doesn't it seem to apply to?
Yes, I look around and around people taking drugs, and they're putting infants, toddlers on psychotropic drugs for attention deficit disorder.
It's important to point out too that it's very clearly pharmacological in the novel. It's not. This is not people going to opium dens and hanging out with a bunch of hippies and smoking pot. This is like big pharma.
Yeah. And this goes back to the whole Rockefeller planning through this creation of Big Pharma. Was a Rockefeller project. And this was getting everyone addicted to these drugs. It's most important to point out that, of course, the Rockefellers and the other elite reject allopathic medicine.
Yes, and that's what John the Savage, when he tries to start a revolution in the novel, he says he goes and tries to tell people, and the people try to kill him.
Well, that's another thing today. It's almost like that's kind of like the allegory of the cave, right?
That scene mirrors the allegory of the cave perfectly.
And of course, it's a story that he tells, but that Huxley tells. But like most psychopaths, they're not very original. They're just borrowing other ideas.
Yeah, which leads me to think he probably did rip his novel off that other guy.
But today, if you do tell people, these things, you will get ridiculed, and you won't rise very high in the corporate world, which is why they're trying to make everything corporate.
Yeah, and it's important to point out too that academia, everybody's under the impression that like there's the state and government and academia is that, and then there's this other thing over here that that's the libertarian corporate business world, and then there's like socialist. No. When you go to the university, you have to understand that you're intimately entwined into a corporate setting, and that's why all of these companies will actually recruit directly out of the universities. You will get they work in tandem with these big corporations. All the universities do. And they also, I lost my train of thought.
Well, the whole idea of the notion of academia being separate from the corporate world, when it's all one
it's
corporation.
Not, right. And, but I had it's so like the textbooks, right? So like the pharmaceutical companies will have a big say in what psychology students or biology students read in their textbooks. And I mean, come on, is that not obvious? Of
Yeah.
course they will.
And
So you're going to be learning everything in your biology books and your textbooks predicated on Darwinian anthropology and the idea that the best way to treat anything is just to throw more chemicals at it because, well, we're just a collection of chemicals anyway, right?
yeah.
Well, that's all. That's the whole base. The whole basis of the pharmaceutical industry is the Darwinian presupposition.
Mm-hmm.
And if Darwinian presuppositions aren't true, then that means that this whole thing collapses as well.
So they can never afford to admit any error.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
It's House of Cards, and that's also applies to the medical establishment. See, the modern medicine is based on all that too, and the idea that 10 years ago, junk DNA. Well, that's all based on Darwinism, and that affects like how you approach medicine and the body and health. Well, if that's not true, then that revolutionizes how you approach the body and medicine and health. Junk DNA.
Mm-hmm.
There's not junk DNA. All the DNA has a purpose and a function, even if we don't know about it. But the Darwinians needed to say that there was all this junk DNA that was vestigial. Oh, and now Dawkins completely contradicts himself from 10 years ago and says we have all this proof now. Junk DNA no longer is junk, and in fact, it proves evolution. And literally, you can find the clip 10 years ago. He says the exact opposite.
Yeah, because all the vestigial, same thing they did with tonsils, and now they find out that tonsils do serve an important function.
Or the appendix, right?
The appendix, and they find out they were cutting these things out right and left. Difference if you have an infected appendix.
So if that presupposition is wrong, then the way that the totality of how medicine is approached is going to be off, because it's going to base its view of the body on all of that, and you're going to have a completely erroneous approach and diagnosis of solutions. A great example of which is vaccinations, in my view.
Yeah.
So inoculations are based on a lot of the same idea of junk DNA, and that it doesn't matter if you just stick things in your arm directly into your bloodstream, which is like not the way that our bodies are designed to take things in.
Yeah, you're not interacting with the diseases the way you're supposed to do. It's going directly into the muscle, and it bypasses your immune system, which is why people get sore throats all the time and nasal infections. Well, that's actually a good thing, because your body, it's intermediary. You're getting introduced to those infections before they get to your organs, and then you develop real immunity.
Absolutely.
And not to mention the fact that your cells, you get cellular immunity from like chickenpox, which prevent you from getting cancer later in life. But that, of course, then that would cut into the profits of the cancer industry. Yeah.
Yes. So a huge part of it is just the desire to sap your life savings out of all this, right?
Which is kind of like how the whole system's designed. It's almost like the Matrix, right? Where the
really
batteries being sucked.
We're batteries for this big parasite. Yeah.
And it's designed in that way. And again, it's how do you excuse if you want to promote good health, you promote immunity, strong immune systems and good health do it through nutrition and good, public hygiene and health and better diets and all that stuff. But you can't. How do you patent vitamins and nutrition? You can't patent, but you can patent drugs. And so, good health doesn't.
Monsanto would like to, I'm sure, to patent.
Well, that's what they do. But it's like they're eventually going to do with hemp or something. You're going to mimic it and then patent it. It's like, at the same time,
patenting DNA strands is completely insane, right?
Which explains how the whole system really works. It's a one big, almost like a piracy.
It is, and what you start to see, I mean, so people have a hard time figuring out, well, how could this all be so organized and uniform? Well, that's because the best explanation for that is because there's a devil.
Now you're getting, so there you go again, bringing up the devil. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, that gets back to, wow. It all goes back to that.
There are spiritual forces that have a unified agenda that are above the human domain.
And who did what did the devil tempt Christ with? Principalities and powers, right? So
and he said, "I'll give you all these powers and dominions if you fall down and worship me."
Yeah.
And what does Jesus say about the devil? He's a liar and a thief, and so that's why we can tie this back into stagecraft and deception, is because the devil's the original con man.
It's only fitting that the devil would go into politics as a profession. So. Well, Jay, that's a great way to finish this up, because I've had you over for over 2 hours now, And I knew it would be a wandering conversation, but that's what I intended it to be tonight.
Always a pleasure.
So we covered a lot of ground. Again, that's jaysanalysis.com, and his new show is coming up this month. It's Health Rangers. What was that network again?
Natural News has
Natural
started
News.
a site. It's called talknetwork.com.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, I'll have all those posted at Jay's Analysis, linking over there and all that when it premieres. And I can't recall the exact premiere date because it's been moved back, but it'll be in the next few weeks.
Great, and of course, in Halloween, you're going down to Austin, Texas. Huh?
Yeah, I'll be speaking on breakaway civilization and predictive programming in Hollywood as it relates to sort of the secret tech and all that. So yeah.
Okay, say hello to Catherine Austin Fitz for me.
Yeah, I'm excited to meet her and Jim Mars and Dr. Farrell. So it'll be a lot of fun.
Ever thought of hitting her up for an interview?
Yes, in fact, I've got a list of people that I mean to get to, and yeah, she is on that list.
Yeah, she's fascinating. So, listen, thanks. We'll talk again and take care.
All right, thank you.